I'm Dom Nicholls, and this is Ukraine the latest. Today, as another Russian oligarch dies in mysterious circumstances after falling from a window, we analyse quite how good the North Korean soldiers apparently on their way to Ukraine actually are.
Bravery takes you through the most unimaginable hardships to finally reward you with victory.
The first duty of my government is security and defence, to make clear our unshakable support of NATO and with our allies towards Ukraine.
Kyiv stands strong.
Nobody's going to break us. We're strong. We're Ukrainians.
It's Monday, the 21st of October, 2 years and 245 days since the full-scale invasion began. And today, I'm joined by our Berlin correspondent James Rothwell and freelance journalist Kateryna Shenheliia. I started with the latest battlefield updates from Ukraine and Russia. So over the weekend, there were Ukrainian drone strikes against the Lipetsk 2 airbase near the Russian city of Lipetsk. That's about 250 kilometers northeast of Kharkiv, about 400 km south of Moscow. There were also drone strikes against the Russian state-owned defense enterprise Sverdlov. That's in Dzержinsk, about 300 kilometers east of Moscow. They were all overnight Saturday, Sunday. Now, Ukraine's general staff said forces from the SBU, that's the Ukrainian Security Service, and military intelligence, and Ukraine's special ops forces, hit the Lipetsk 2 base, causing a fire and secondary explosions. It's thought Russia keeps Su-34s, Su-35s and MiG-31 fighter bombers at the site there. Now, Lipetsk Oblast Governor Igor Artemonov said a number of drones had been brought down. That's all he said. That's probably true, but they seem to have come down in the right place. Definitely something got through. Now, the Sverdlov defence manufacturing plant produces chemicals for artillery ammunition, and it stores and produces glide bombs. The ISW, Institute for the Study of War, they say that sources in Ukrainian intelligence have been speaking to Western and Ukrainian news outlets, saying that the plant is one of Russia's largest explosive factories. The US imposed sanctions on it, on the Sverdlov plant, in July last year. Now, those two drone strikes on that manufacturing plant and on the Lipetsk airbase, they may well have been part of the much wider Ukrainian aerial effort overnight on that Saturday, Sunday night. Russia's MOD, the Ministry of Defence, said at least 110 drones were intercepted, in their words, over various regions of Russia on Saturday night, Sunday morning. The largest number, they say, was over Kursk region, where 43 drones were, well, they say identified. So I don't know if that means brought down or just observed flying over. Elsewhere on the ground, marginal Ukrainian advances in Kursk region and similarly small Russian advances in the Donbass, although on the southern region of the Donbass, Selidove, that's about 15 km southeast of Pokrovsk, that has been repeatedly assaulted over the weekend with mechanised troops, as in troops in armoured personnel carriers, tanks and whatnot. No breakthroughs there, though, but that seems to have been a particularly violent area. Today, or overnight last night, Ukrainian air defences say they shot down 59 of 116 Shahed-type drones launched by Russia. This comes from Ukraine's Air Force. Another 45 drones were reportedly lost, which, we take as shorthand for electronic warfare, either brought them down or sent them back from whence they came. Now, other drone and missile strikes over the weekend caused loss of life and injuries in an arc, basically Sumy in the north, around the east, Donbass, into Zaporizhia in the south. Lots of other areas were targeted with those drones, but no report of casualties elsewhere in the country. And then about 10 p.m. last night, Russia hit 3 districts in Kharkiv city with glide bombs. So far, 13 injured, no deaths reported from that. But it's just so normal. 10 p.m. Sunday night, just whack a few glide bombs in. I mean, if anybody can knit that together into some kind of operational campaign and strategy, then feel free. But otherwise, I will just consider that as terrorism. Now, elsewhere, reports out of Russia over the weekend that a former vice president of the Russian Nicholls oil company, a guy called Mikhail Rogachev, was found dead in a possible suicide after falling out of a window in Moscow. Now, Russian sources say Rogachev left a suicide note and had been suffering from late-stage cancer, but other unspecified people within his inner circle have been quoted as denying that he had cancer and said that his death came as a complete surprise to his family. Now, Telegram channels close to the Russian security services said that his body was... keep straight face. Said that his body was discovered by an SVR agent, so the SVR is Russia's foreign intelligence service, who happened to be walking a dog outside his building on Saturday morning just when the body landed. So I've just got to work on those face muscles. He is the latest of nearly a dozen Russian energy executives to die in mysterious circumstances over the past 2 years. No further explanation, no comment from the Kremlin. Why would they? It's a suicide. All very rum, to which, of course, the only response is, Andre, you've lost another oligarch. Now, speaking of mysterious deaths, Russian pilot Dmitry Galenkov was also found dead in the town of Supernevo in Bryansk Oblast, that borders Ukraine. It's about this area, Supernevo, is about 100 k's north of the nearest Ukrainian border. This was yesterday morning, reported, interestingly, by Ukraine's military intelligence. Okay. So they say Galenkov suffered multiple head injuries, probably caused by a hammer, and published photos purporting to show his body, although they didn't claim responsibility for the incident. Okay. But the HUR, that's Ukraine's military intelligence, they said that Galenkov had served as chief of staff of a Russian aviation squadron. In US and UK and many other Western countries, chief of staff is often taken to be the sort of second in command. I don't know if that's the case in Russia, but he was a pilot of the 52nd Heavy Bomber Regiment. That's based at the Shaykovka airfield, about another 100 k's north, and that base hosts the big Tupolevs, the Tu-22 M3 bombers that are regularly used to carry out missile attacks against Ukraine. Now, the HUR, so all these comments are coming from Ukraine's military intelligence, nothing from Russia. HUR saying Galenkov was involved in missile strikes on Ukrainian civilian targets, including, you may remember, the Amstor shopping mall attack in Kremenchuk, June 22, that killed 22 people, injuring dozens more. He was also thought to have been involved in the wave of strikes and the attack on an apartment building in the city of Dnipro in January 23. That wave was one of the deadliest single Russian attacks on Ukraine. That killed 46 people, including 6 children. Next one. G7 defence ministers. They met for the first time, as in the defence side of it, met for the first time over the weekend in Naples. They reiterated in their closing communique their unwavering support, quote unquote, for Ukraine. It was the first ever defence ministerial meeting of the G7, as I say, held in Naples. In their final statement, they said, "We condemn Russia, which has put in place a posture of confrontation and destabilisation on a global scale, also resorting to hybrid warfare and the irresponsible use of nuclear rhetoric. We support Ukraine on its irreversible path to full Euro-Atlantic integration, including NATO membership." So I wouldn't expect a lot more from the G7, to be perfectly honest. I mean, it's not a defence body in and of itself, so I think that's probably about as much as we could hope for there. However, meanwhile, France's Foreign Minister, Jean-Noël Barrot, he was in Kyiv on Saturday, where he pledged support for President Zelensky's victory plan and said that he would work with Ukrainian officials to secure other nations' backing for the proposal. Monsieur Barrot said a Russian victory would be a consecration for the law of the strongest and would push the international order towards chaos. Just in the last couple of hours, we've seen news that US Defense Secretary Lloyd Austin has arrived in Kyiv this morning for talks with his opposite number, Rustem Umerov, and probably, I would expect, President Zelensky as well. We'll get a readout of that hopefully tomorrow. Very sprightly Mr. Austin leapt off the train. I mean, there is a bit of a gap, and the train's quite high up. The steps are a bit awkward, so he just sort of jumped off the train, but made a pretty sort of good Spider-Man landing. Anyway. Now, I'd like to introduce Berlin correspondent James. Really interesting. I saw this over the weekend. Lithuania's Foreign Minister, Gabrielius Landsbergis, said in a tweet yesterday, at the beginning of the year, Emmanuel Macron hinted at putting boots on the ground. At the end of the year, North Korea actually did. We're still on the back foot reacting to escalation instead of reversing it. Macron's ideas should now be revisited. Better late than never. Now, his comments, James, you'll know, come as South Korea's intelligence services have warned that Russia has transferred 1,500 North Korean special ops troops to Vladivostok, the Russian port city, with more soldiers expected in the near future. And then I noticed, you're probably ahead of me on this one, James, but just in the last couple of hours, really interesting, the office of South Korea's president issued a statement saying that President Yoon Suk-yeol had a telephone conversation with NATO Secretary General Mark Rutte at Mr. Rutte's request. Really interesting, that bit, I think. This was regarding this deployment of North Korean combat troops. They discussed future response measures, apparently. So, James, you've been looking more into this and these troops that North Korea may or may not be sending. What have you found, and what do you make of that call at Mark Rutte's request to chat to South Korea? Hello, James. Good to speak to you again.
Hello, Dom. Thanks. Yes, so my sort of task over the weekend for the Sunday Telegraph was to do a bit of digging into what the Korean Special Forces actually are, the North Korean Special Forces, and whether they might pose much of a risk to Ukrainian fighters if they do indeed get taken from Russia, where they seem to be being sent at the moment, over to the front. Very sort of secretive organisation, as you might expect from Special Forces. And what I was able to find out is that they are presumed to be members of something called the SOF, the Special Operations Force. Now, the thing to stress about this force is that they are considered to be the most loyal, or some of the most loyal soldiers to the Kim regime. They're very motivated, they're very highly trained, but they're likely to be lacking in the advanced military equipment that you might see from Russian or NATO forces, in large part due to North Korea being a sort of pariah state. And their track record as a special forces operation is, to put it frankly, not great. They seem to have been formed in the mid-60s, and in 1968, and this is probably their most famous operation, they were involved in an attempt to storm the Blue House, which is the South Korean equivalent of the White House. And it was basically a complete catastrophe. 29 out of the 31 North Korean SOF troops who were sent to take part in that operation were killed, and the unit that they are in was basically disbanded after that. So you could infer from that what you will of what their capabilities are like to be, though I stress that happened all the way back in the 1960s. I interviewed an analyst from Grey Dynamics, which is a private security firm based out of London. They did quite an interesting report on the SOF relatively recently, which says they're understood to have 12 light infantry brigades, 3 reconnaissance units, so that's operating behind enemy lines. In this context, 3 airborne divisions and 3 sniper units as well. And US officials have described them as highly trained, highly motivated, and fitted with the best available equipment, emphasis on available, what they're able to get their hands on. I spoke also to Professor Hazel Smith, who's basically one of the leading experts on North Korea in the United Kingdom. And she was actually quite skeptical about this news over the weekend when I spoke to her. She pointed out that South Korean intelligence has got a bit of a track record, for example, of announcing that a North Korean official has been executed, only for them to turn up on state TV sometime later looking distinctly unexecuted. And she did not dismiss this report entirely, but she recommended taking it with a pinch of salt in light of that. But as you say, Dom, I think it's really interesting that we've seen this statement come out of South Korea earlier today, which says that at NATO's request, the South Koreans have given a sort of briefing, if you like, a telephone conversation, which goes into, one can presume NATO received a bit more detail about the nature of this special forces unit or division that's been deployed. The other thing that I would observe about this decision to put special forces potentially in East Ukraine, and this is informed by the interview with Professor Smith, who's an expert on this, is that it does seem like a bit of an unusual decision. We know that Eastern Ukraine is basically a kind of meat grinder battlefield. Special forces, as we understand them in the West, would presumably be involved in something much more delicate, covert and complex than fighting on a meat grinder battlefield. It's not immediately clear what they might be getting involved over there. And one presumes that the Special Forces soldiers don't speak Russian as well. And if they don't speak Russian, it's difficult to see again how they would be able to coordinate with their Russian counterparts on more complex operations. And that kind of gives you an idea of how this would actually work on the ground in terms of the kind of granular day-to-day activities of these troops. If they don't even speak Russian, there's a bit of a question mark over how much use they would be for anything more complex than just marching through the battlefield as cannon fodder. And in fact, there is a suggestion now, or speculation, I should say, that they might just be cannon fodder, these special forces. The North Korean SOF is not like the SAS or Delta Force. They are special by the standards of the North Korean army, basically, which is very different, of course, from Western special forces. And Professor Smith suggested to me that their loyalty might actually be their key ingredient here. If North Korea sends soldiers to fight in Ukraine, there is a very high risk that they will just surrender the minute they get into contact with the enemy. That, of course, creates a risk of defections. It creates a risk, even if they are cannon fodder, of loss of intelligence relating to the North Korean regime or the North Korean military. And so the theory is that the only reason these 1,500 North Korean special forces are involved is not so much their skill in battle, but their loyalty, the fact that they are unlikely to surrender and that they would actually fight rather than immediately run away or surrender or defect. So that is what I was able to glean, if you like, about this SOF division, which, by the way, is understood to have about 200,000 soldiers in total. And my understanding, and you'll know a lot more about this than I do, Dom, but my understanding is that's a lot of soldiers for something considered special forces. My understanding of the SAS, for example, is it's only got about 500 to 600 people in it at any given time. So if they are special forces, the SOF, it's an unusually large battalion, you could say.
Yes, absolutely. Thanks, James. I mean, for my money, you've probably heard me say this before, but I think special is the worst word in the military lexicon, often enthusiastically embraced by charlatans and big timers. And anyone who's actually spent any time with the good folk in Fort Liberty or Virginia Beach will know the difference, or the equivalent over here. Anyway, James, whilst I've got you, and elsewhere, of course, whilst I've got you, I'd like to have a quick look at Moldova, if possible, election results. Now, yesterday, saw a presidential election. The current Moldovan president, Maia Sandu, is up for re-election, and a referendum on the European Union, which, if passed, would change the Moldovan constitution to define EU membership as one of Moldova's strategic objectives. So it's not a referendum on joining per se. You know, that's longer down the line. It's just about changing or cementing Moldova's direction of travel, if you like. Now, both are said to have passed the required voter turnout threshold to be valid. That's 1/3 of voter turnout. What can you tell us the latest of the Moldovan elections there, James?
Yes, so an interesting story this. According to the latest results, it looks like Moldova has very narrowly voted in favour of a commitment to join the European Union. So a change to the constitution that would open the door to joining the EU in the future. As you say, this is not the same as a referendum on whether to join the EU. It's more about Moldova's direction of travel, as you put it, its aspirations. And a fresh report out of the BBC says that yes, as in yes, we would like to join the EU, won with 50.31% of the vote, whereas no got 49.69% of the vote. That was with over 99% of the votes counted. So it appears that yes has won. That is a staggeringly narrow margin, and it is not what Moldova was expecting to happen. There had been a view that this referendum would comfortably pass over there, and it hasn't, which is very interesting. Maia Sandu, the incumbent pro-EU president, she has already said that this rather murky result is the result of foreign interference in Moldovan politics, almost certainly Russia. And it's worth pointing out in the background context of this referendum that a pro-Russian businessman, Ilan Shaw, who is not based in Moldova, he seems to live in Russia, had actually offered to pay money to convince, quote, as many people as possible to either vote no in this referendum or abstain. That claim has been rejected by Russia. Dmitry Peskov, the Kremlin spokesman, has, as one would expect, poured cold water on that suggestion today. But I just want to zoom in on some very, very interesting reporting by the BBC's correspondent over there, Sarah Rainsford, who basically came across some evidence of paid for votes going on during the referendum. And I'm just going to read very briefly from their reporting. A woman who just dropped her ballot in the transparent election referendum box was basically overheard by the BBC asking when she would get paid for voting. Very mysterious, very suspicious. They confronted this woman outside of the polling station, and she apparently admitted to being offered money in return for voting. She said that she got a mysterious phone call from a man who sent her to the polling station to vote and then stopped answering her calls. The BBC quotes her as saying, "He tricked me." She didn't say which side she had been asked to vote for. So make of that what you will. But very interesting little anecdote there from the BBC's reporting team. It looks like basically by accident they came across someone who had been offered money to vote in the referendum. And as I said earlier, there is evidence that the pro-Russian side was trying to pay people to vote no. So there will be a lot of concern as a result of that this referendum has been tampered with in order to perhaps not lead to the no vote winning, because as I said, the results suggest that yes had won, but to make the results as close as possible. And making the result as close as possible is still significant. It will create the impression, false or otherwise, that this is not a finished issue for Moldovans. It creates the impression that this is a controversial issue, whereas, as I said before, public opinion actually does seem to be quite strongly in favour of joining the EU. And of course, an aspiration to join the EU speaks to Moldovan aspirations and ambitions to get closer to the West and not to Russia, which is sort of chewing the leg off that country via hybrid warfare, as we all know, and as we've discussed at length, I think, in previous podcast episodes. So some quite disquieting news in that sense from Moldova. Dom.
Yeah, I saw that. I've retweeted Sarah's little piece on that, as in the video clip. Sarah Rainsford, the BBC's Eastern Europe correspondent. She was formerly in Moscow and then had her credentials removed, basically got kicked out of Moscow. I think she speaks fluent Russian, so it must have overheard this woman. And then in the video that she put out that I've retweeted, she asked the woman how much she got paid. She said 1,000 rubles, which I think, having done some quick maths, is about £9 or $10. So that seems to have been the price there. But you're right. I mean, the Dmitry Peskov, Kremlin press spokesman, came straight out of the blocks and demanded Ms. Sandu provide evidence for this claim of foreign interference, to which I kind of looked down and thought, well, it's none of your business, Dominic. You're in Russia. This is about Moldova. Why on earth are you interested there? And why are you getting so rattled about what's happening in Moldova? Unless it's your love of global democracy. But no, interesting. So that, I mean, you're right. It was closer than, and yes, it will fuel fire amongst those who want to start fires. And I think we all know who they are, that, it's still a live issue, but it has happened. And Moldova is very vulnerable to Russian hybrid warfare, grey zone tactics, disinformation, call it what you will, as is Georgia. We'll come on to that in a moment. But just before you go, James, have you seen anything about this UK-Germany defence pact? I saw John Healey, Britain's defence secretary, putting out a statement about it. But have you looked at it at all? They're talking it up. I don't know if it is as big a deal as the Lancaster House Treaty in 2010 with France. But have you looked at this pact? Is it worth the paper it's written on?
I guess we will see. According to the Sunday Times, which first reported this defence agreement, it may be signed as soon as this week. The details on what exactly it will involve are a little bit vague, but it does seem to be quite ambitious in scope. The purpose of the agreement is to allow enhanced military exercises on NATO's eastern border with Russia. That's most likely going to be in Estonia and Lithuania. There's, of course, been a lot of NATO training taking part in that region already. And it will also unlock the sorts of things that you would expect from a defence pact, procuring more weapons together, deeper cooperation on producing what's often called the next generation of arms, and so on and so forth. I think it'll be interesting to see if we get more detail on this. It's probably worth mentioning a story last week that was quite interesting, a memorandum of understanding that was signed by Rheinmetall, a very important German arms manufacturer in the Ukraine context. They're helping the Ukrainians produce artillery shells, and Leonardo, an Italian arms manufacturer based over there. And their memorandum of understanding actually is along similar lines to this apparent UK-German defence pact, but at the level of two major companies. That's going to be working on developing the next generation of battle tanks, not in the context of defending Ukraine, but more about replenishing domestic stockpiles of arms and looking to the future. Obviously, one of the issues that support of Ukraine has thrown up is that a lot of material has been sent over to the Ukrainians, which inevitably needs to be replaced back at home. So there's a lot of work being done on this in Europe, particularly in Germany at the moment, not just at the state level, as this defence agreement suggests, but also between major arms manufacturers in Europe. And we will see, I suppose, perhaps as soon as in the coming days, what exactly it's going to achieve. But as I think you rightly suggest, Dom, sometimes an arms agreement or a defence agreement can be announced, and then once it's all written down in black and white, it perhaps doesn't look quite as sweeping or bold as the press releases and so on may have suggested. But we will see.
Yeah, interesting. I mean, in showing a bit of ankle, in final thoughts, I'm going to talk about the defence manufacturing agreements going on at the moment with South Korea. I think it's really interesting what's happening there on the industrial side. But James, thank you so much for that. You're very welcome. Do please hang around for final thoughts if you wish. If you have to dash off, then that's absolutely fine. But it'd be lovely to have you. Now, that was a view including from Moldova, another country that's equally firmly in Russia's sights for disinformation and hybrid warfare, as I say, is Georgia. Delighted to have back on the pod Kateryna Shenheliia. Kat, welcome back. Now, you are Georgian, you're our Georgia whisperer. Can you tell me, please, I know there's an election coming up in, 6 days' time, on Saturday this week, but there were lots of protests in Georgia yesterday, over the weekend, but not immediately and directly connected to the election, as far as I can tell. Kat, what's happening in Georgia? And can you give us a bit of a view forward for the election, please?
Hi, everyone. It's great to be back. Just before I start, I want to say, look, if the price of a Moldovan voter is 1,000 rubles, which is 10 quid, it means apparently that Georgian voters cost quite a bit more, because in previous elections, when the current ruling party got caught paying people to vote for them, they paid 28 quid. So just interesting political economy of corruption. Well, to answer your question, and I apologize to the listeners for my voice, I'm a bit sick. The protests which took place over the weekend consisted predominantly of two purposes. First, it was a way to rally the pro-European voter base at a time when the Georgian government has been facing a barrage of criticism by the EU and the US over democratic backsliding. Second, it was basically a stage for the Georgian public to tell the West, hey, don't give up on us just yet. The president herself was present, and she managed to earn cheers and smiles from the crowd, even though her speech was repeatedly disrupted by provocateurs who were trying to blind her with lasers from hotel rooftops, which, if you have a child who's blasted lasers in your eyes, you know how painful that is, and yet she pulled through. There has been no reaction that is atypical, really. Yes, the protests happened. People are gearing up for whatever awaits the public. We just do not know. There's a lot of, not fog of war, but I guess pre-election fog that right now is hovering over the streets of Tbilisi and many other Georgian cities.
Thanks. Can you just dial us in, please? Who are the main parties in Saturday's election, and what are the main issues?
Well, you have 150 seats will be up for grabs this Saturday, and 76 are needed for a majority. Last election in 2020, I think GD secured like 90. I think they secured 90, and this.
Sorry, can you explain GD? Explain GD, please, Kat.
Sorry, yeah. So GD, I'll be using the shorthand. It's short for Georgian Dream. It's the current pro-Russian, supposedly pro-Western as well, but pro-Russian ruling party. They are, of course, running again. And last election, they secured 90 seats. This year, however, things are very different because we're now a third year into the Russian invasion of Ukraine and its consequences, which hit domestic Georgian politics as well. So a very quick rundown. You have the ruling party. Here are your characters. The ruling party, Georgian Dream. The Mishists, as they're called, or supporters of the jailed ex-president of Georgia, Mikhail Saakashvili. It includes the United National Movement, Strategy Akhmashenebeli, and European Georgia. Do not worry about pronouncing this. Let's go. Coalition for Change, which consists of kind of new leaders that stepped forward into the limelight after Saakashvili was imprisoned. They include Achali, Droa, and Girchi, who are like the local Georgian libertarians. You have Strong Georgia. One of its leaders who I want to draw attention to is Aliko Elisashvili, which, if you keep up with Georgian politics at all, he was the guy who sucker punched the Georgian Dream's parliamentary leader a couple weeks back during the foreign agent law hearings. You can just look this video up on Google. It is pretty iconic. And finally, the Alliance of Patriots, which kind of consists of a bunch of LARPers who should have really stuck to just eating sunflower seeds on park benches. This alliance includes Alt Info, which is openly far right and openly pro-Russian party, as well as Georgian Idea. Fundamentally, however, this election is not about just which one party will win. It's about the opposition fighting for a more civilized political culture in the country. I don't think we have time for it right now, but there was a really wonderful quote by the European Parliament, because they just recently had hearings over the political situation in Georgia. And I'll just read a tiny snippet of it. And I think that that quote really puts it best as to what people are really thinking about in the upcoming elections. Quote, "The EU Parliament expresses its concern about the climate of hatred and intimidation fueled by statements by Georgian government representatives and political leaders, as well as the government's attacks on political pluralism, condemns comments by oligarch Bidzina Ivanishvili," this is the guy who funds Georgian Dream, "and leading figures of the government, threatening to ban opposition parties and referring to the opposition as a, quote, criminal political force, and notes that such intimidation seriously undermines the political process and the freedom of expression and contributes to an environment of fear," unquote.
Thank you. I mean, so in a nutshell, not that I try and condense everything to very easy sound bites, but there's a battle here for the soul, a bit like Moldova, a battle for the soul of the country. Which way is it facing? That's why Russia's getting very hot under the collar. Comments from Dmitry Peskov and all the effort that we've seen in Moldova. I mean, has there been any evidence of election interference so far in Georgia? And what do you think the chances are of a peaceful election on Saturday?
I'll answer your second question later. I mean, look, of course, yes, evidence is kind of a shaky and a relative thing when it comes to Georgian or honestly any East European elections. The Georgian Dream officials, they accuse the radical opposition, as they call them, of partaking in foreign interference and anti-government propaganda. They cited Western officials visiting Georgia as forms of foreign election interference, as well as the president voicing her opinion as a means of misappropriating public funds. But they had a very shaky reasoning as to why that would be considered misappropriating funds. In the meantime, the Russian government actually lifted visa restrictions on Georgia, which have been in place for years. That to them did not seem like election interference, even though the opposition said that it was. Finally, you have the monitoring mission, My Voice. They pretty much accuse the government of depriving government employees, as well as socially vulnerable individuals, of their ID documents and coercing them to vote for the ruling party. Journalists also claimed that employees of state institutions are just being forced to provide personal information about themselves and their family members so that it can be passed on to the ruling party. If that is not election interference, I don't know what it is. As for the peaceful electoral process, Jesus fighting through the flu, I honestly do not know. There's no predicting whether there will be a random mass brawl in the middle of a city streets, nor what the results, what they will be. Pro-opposition and pro-government polling bodies such as Edison Research, opposition, and Gorby, pro-government, they published completely different results. But both placed Georgian Dream with the highest percentage of the vote out of all the parties. The real question is whether Georgian Dream will secure an absolute majority. Following the elections, Zurabishvili will have about 2 months left in power if she's not impeached. Before the parliament will have to pick another president. We don't really know what awaits us. However, we can get some hints about what the government will act like if things do not go the way they plan, based on an announcement that came, I think, either this morning or last night from the Ministry of Internal Affairs of Georgia, where they reminded, quote, the public that no law prohibits the simultaneous use of water cannons and tear gas to disperse protests, unquote.
Yeah, well, interesting. But having been at a riot once where the police then had to get out of the way and allow the water cannon to come through, and the water cannon just basically just did a little piddle on the ground because they'd forgotten to fill it up. I can assure you the water cannon aren't always the answer to your counter-protest dreams. But anyway, thank you, Kat, for that. Later, we hear the team's final thoughts. I want to go back to that statement by the office of the South Korean president. I thought it contained a very interesting note. It's buried down in the middle of it. It's quite a short statement. You'll find it on their website, the website of the office of South Korea's president. But it said, in the middle, it said, the president said that he would swiftly dispatch a delegation to share information and take steps to activate security cooperation between Korea, Ukraine and NATO. This is obviously, in relation to North Korean troops on the move. The statement goes on, in response to the president's hope that our process of joining the NATO Battlefield Information Collection and Exploitation System, a thing called BICES, would proceed quickly so that Korea and NATO could communicate in real time and share information safely and efficiently, Secretary General Luther, I think they meant Rutte, responded that he would actively look after it so that progress could be made quickly. Now, I thought that was quite interesting, not only because they got Mark Rutte's name wrong, but they talk about BICES. BICES is a data management and information sharing system common across NATO. I sort of played around with it a little bit, used to use the computer to prop open the fire door, that kind of thing. Was never a massive fan, but then it must have evolved in the next few years. But the fact that BICES is being extended to South Korea, and we saw that at last week's NATO ministerial, South Korea, Japan, Australia and New Zealand were there, not just in observer status, but they actually took part in the meetings. Really interesting, the moves now between NATO and partners elsewhere in the world, particularly Asia-Pacific areas. Now, just sticking, final thought from me, sticking with South Korea, 2 years ago, or in 2022, South Korean President Yoon Suk-yeol, he said publicly that his goal was that his country would one day be amongst the world's top 4 weapons suppliers. Now, taking data from 2018 to 22, it's already in the top 10. So the Stockholm International Peace Research Institute, they're the sort of daddies of this area of data, they put them at number 9. So South Korea is already up there as a major arms manufacturer and supplier. They are a huge manufacturer and increasingly exporter. Look at what they're doing over the tanks with Poland. But I just think, South Korea's got huge potential there, defense potential in terms of manufacturing. If they're moving closer, if South Korea is moving closer to NATO, particularly and specifically through the lens of Ukraine, the war in Ukraine and the North Korean efforts there, I just wonder if that whole thing, getting a bit of extra cannon fodder from North Korea might have been one of Russia, one of Putin's biggest mistakes in this thing. You could argue that it was a genuinely strategic move. The word strategic is banded around a bit too much in this war, but genuinely strategic to get another country on side and supplying weapons and equipment. But I just wonder if that in and of itself has been, in the long term, a bad decision for Russia. If it wakes up, wrong phrase, I apologise, but if it spurs South Korea to take a much greater role and want closer relationships with NATO and a greater role in the war and have much closer defence industrial cooperation with Europe, my God, what could happen in the next few years? So very, very interesting, I thought. But, hey, I have been wrong before. Let me know what you think. James, would you let us know your final thoughts for today, please?
Thanks. Following on from what you've just said, Dom, I'd probably leave you with some thoughts on China and how China plays into this North Korea, South Korea story. As you know, the Kim regime is kind of the little nephew of China. Sees North Korea as a sort of buffer zone between itself and the US allied South Korea as well. And it's interested in the long-term survival of the Kim regime. It's therefore not interested in North Korea pursuing risky or reckless acts. And I think you could reasonably state that North Korea apparently deciding to get involved in a far-flung war over in Europe counts as risky, which means that China's probably not very happy about this development. And I think it'll be very interesting in the near future if more information comes out of China on what their perspective on this is. It feels like a risky move for North Korea to take. It also feels like a move that it wouldn't or couldn't take without China's approval, which may not even have been given. So behind the scenes, this speaks to some quite interesting political intrigue going on over in the Far East. But as I said, China is a significant part of this story, even if they haven't come to the forefront yet. And let's see how that progresses.
We certainly will. Thanks, James. Kat, would you like the last words for today, please?
That's quite a big honor and a lot of weight on my shoulders. I mean, there's 2 points to make. If you are a Georgian citizen, make sure you're registered if you live outside of Georgia. Make sure all of your documents are up to date. And if you live within Georgia, also make sure your documents are up to date. It's very important for Georgians to show up to cast their vote. Thankfully, we Georgians are still able to vote, and that's super, super important. That's on the domestic front. On kind of the larger East European front, it remains to be seen how the Moldovan elections and the war in Ukraine will impact the Georgian public. Georgians really are scared of potentially a second front opening. And I think it's very crucial that the West needs to not abandon the Georgians at this time, because they've suffered a lot and they waited many years to try to move westward, much like Moldova is. And I think the people would be very disappointed if their effort would go nowhere. It remains to be seen. Thoughts and prayers. That's really the best I can give you at this time.
Thanks, Kat. Appreciate that. And I should make it clear that the Telegraph takes no view on these elections. We're not telling anybody which way they should vote. We just report it and analyse it and discuss it during and after. But we will continue to do all that. Thank you, everybody, for today. Thanks, everyone, for listening. We'll be back again tomorrow. I think we've got a bit of a dream team tomorrow. I think we've got Hamish and the F-Bomb in town. Hope you can join us then. But from the Telegraph in London, thanks, James. Thanks, Kat. Thanks for listening. I wish you all a very good afternoon. Ukraine the Latest is an original podcast from the Telegraph, created by David Nicholls. To support our work and stay on top of all of our Ukraine news, analysis and dispatches from the ground, please subscribe to The Telegraph. You can get your first 3 months for just £1 at www.telegraph.co.uk/Ukraine the Latest. Or sign up to Dispatches, our foreign affairs newsletter, bringing stories from our award-winning foreign correspondents straight to your inbox. We also have a Ukraine Live blog on our website, where you can follow updates as they come in throughout the day, including insights from regular contributors to this podcast. We also do the same for other breaking international stories. You can listen to this conversation live at 1 p.m. London time each weekday on Twitter Spaces. Follow The Telegraph so that you don't miss it. To our listeners on YouTube, please note that due to issues beyond our control, there is sometimes a delay between broadcast and upload. So if you want to hear Ukraine the Latest as soon as it's released, do refer to podcast apps. If you appreciated this podcast, please consider following Ukraine the Latest on your preferred podcast app and leave us a review, as it really helps others find the show. Please also share it with those who may not be aware we exist. You can also get in touch directly to ask questions or give comments by emailing ukrainepod@telegraph.co.uk. We do continue to read every message. You can also contact us directly on Twitter. You can find our handles in the description for this episode. As ever, we're especially interested to hear where you are listening from around the world. Ukraine the Latest was today produced by Rachel Porter. Executive producers are Louisa Wells and David Nicholls.